My name is Marlena Voss. I am 36 years old. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, and on the morning of October 14th, 2023, I sat behind a conference table on the 14th floor of a building in Uptown and opened a manila folder with a candidate's name printed at the top: Derek Allen Callahan, age 39, pharmaceutical sales, my ex-husband. The man who had told me, in the third week of my second chemotherapy cycle, that he was not built for this. The man who had moved out over a weekend while I was still losing my hair. The man who had signed our divorce papers and been photographed at a restaurant in Ballantyne with another woman 4 months before the ink was even dry. He had no idea I worked at Praxis Health Solutions. The job listing had carried my title, not my name. The third-party recruiter who submitted him had not put the pieces together. Derek had applied for a senior regional sales director role at a biotech company in Charlotte and had no earthly reason to expect that the person conducting his first-round interview would be me. I want to tell you about the look on his face when he came through that door. I want to tell you everything that happened in that room, every word, every second. I will. But first, I need to go back to the beginning, because that conference room was not where my story ended. It was just where I finally understood how far I had come from the woman who used to be too tired to even look at herself in the mirror. Before we get into this, please like and subscribe, but only if this is already hitting somewhere real for you. And drop your location and local time in the comments right now. I want to know where in the world you are sitting while you listen to this. I read every single one, and I mean that. I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina. My parents are Ellen and Robert Voss. My mother was a registered nurse at Cone Health for 27 years, and my father retired from electrical contracting when I was 16. We were not wealthy. We were stable in the way that matters. There was always dinner on the table. Always a car that ran, always the understanding that my brother Kyle and I would finish school and build something for ourselves. I got a partial academic scholarship to UNC Chapel Hill. I majored in industrial organizational psychology, the science of how people function inside organizations, which sounds abstract until you explain that it's the backbone of every human resources department in the country. I graduated in 2009 with a 3.882 GPA, a strong handshake, and a job offer from Meridian Logistics, a manufacturing and supply chain company headquartered in Charlotte. I started at $41,000 a year. I shared a two-bedroom apartment in the Dilworth neighborhood with a college friend named Joelle Tran, and we split rent at $780 each and took turns making dinner on Sunday nights. Joelle. I need you to hold on to that name. She was a graphic designer, still is, freelance, and fiercely talented. We had met in a communications elective our junior year of college and had been inseparable since. She was the kind of person who made you feel like the most interesting woman in any room just by the quality of her attention. The way she actually listened instead of just waiting for her turn to talk. In the years before everything changed, she was already the most reliable person in my life, and I didn't fully appreciate that until I needed to. In 2014, I was 26 and had been promoted twice at Meridian. I attended the SHRM Carolina Conference in Raleigh, held that year at the Marriott on Fayetteville Street, and I met Derek Callahan at the welcome reception on a Thursday evening in late September. He was 31. He worked as a senior account manager at Novartis Therapeutics, one of the mid-size pharmaceutical companies that sent regional reps to this kind of event, because the networking overlap with HR professionals was useful for their talent pipeline conversations. He was handsome in an obvious, well-maintained way, the kind of man who had learned early that his face opened doors and had spent years cultivating the intelligence to back it up. He was funny, and not in the hollow performative way that conference strangers often are. He was specifically funny. He made jokes that required you to have actually been listening to the conversation, which meant he had actually been listening. He asked about work and took notes on the back of a cocktail napkin when I mentioned a restructuring project I'd managed at Meridian. Not literally, but he remembered the details. He asked follow-up questions an hour later that proved he'd retained everything. I assess people for a living, and I assessed him as thoughtful, emotionally present, and genuinely curious about the world. I know now that he was performing, that what I had interpreted as genuine presence was a practiced skill set, one he had developed over years of selling things to people who needed convincing. But at 26, I had not yet learned to distinguish between a person who is truly there and a person who is very good at seeming to be. We dated for 2 years. He relocated to Charlotte in early 2015 to be with me, which felt significant, a man rearranging his geography for a relationship. He took a position at a competing firm, Nova Bridge Medical, and his salary at that point was around $110,000 with commission. Mine was $67,000. We split everything down the middle, which felt modern and fair, and neither of us talked about money as anything other than a logistical detail. He proposed on New Year's Eve 2015 at the Angus Barn in Raleigh, a 1.2-carat solitaire in a white gold setting. I said yes before he finished the sentence, which I have thought about 1,000 times since. Not with regret, exactly, but with a particular understanding of how completely I had believed in the version of him I was being shown. We married in June 2016 at a vineyard property outside Asheville, 47 guests. My mother cried through the ceremony and danced with my father afterward, to a song I don't remember the title of, just the way they looked. Joelle was my maid of honor and gave a toast that made people laugh and then immediately want to call someone they loved. I wore an off-shoulder gown I'd found at a consignment shop in South End and had tailored for $340, and I thought, I genuinely, without reservation, believed that I had gotten the hard part of life right. We bought a house in Noda, Charlotte's North Davidson Arts District, in March 2017, $387,000. 3 bedrooms, original hardwood floors, crown molding, a kitchen painted pale yellow with white subway tile, and so much natural light that even on gray February mornings it felt warm. Derek was making $127,000 by then. I had been promoted to HR manager at Meridian and was making $78,000. We had a joint account for household expenses and kept our individual accounts. We talked about having children in a year or two once his Southeast Territory numbers stabilized. We traveled to Portugal in 2018 and New Orleans in 2019. We had a life that looked, from the outside, like everything was working. The question I have turned over most in therapy with Dr. Angela Cho at the Charlotte Center for Behavioral Health on South Tryon, where I started going in January 2021 and have continued ever since, is when it stopped working from the inside. I don't have a clean answer. I have accumulations. The trip to Portugal, when he spent 2 evenings on work calls without apologizing for it. The November he worked through Thanksgiving for a regional summit that I found out much later had a +1 policy he hadn't mentioned. The way he stopped asking about my day, and I stopped noticing he'd stopped because I had quietly filled the silence with podcasts and projects and the work of not needing things from people who weren't offering them. I don't know. What I know is that in January 2020, I made a phone call and scheduled a mammogram. My mother's college roommate, Diane, had just been diagnosed with breast cancer at 58. Something in that conversation, the way my mother's voice changed when she said it, the particular quality of her quiet, made me think. I was 32. The guideline said 40 for routine screening. But I had good insurance through Meridian, a low copay, and a specific dread that I couldn't fully name, something that felt less like anxiety and more like information. The radiologist called me 3 days after my appointment and asked me to come back in. They confirmed it on February 6, 2020. Stage 2B invasive ductal carcinoma, left breast. My oncologist was Dr. Patricia Ames at Atrium Health's Levine Cancer Institute on Moorhead Street in Charlotte. She was direct in a way I respected immediately. No tissue boxes shoved across the desk, no softening of language, just information and a plan. Lumpectomy, followed by 4 cycles of chemotherapy, followed by 6 weeks of radiation, followed by 5 years of hormone therapy. Timeline: approximately 1 year of active treatment. I sat in the parking garage of the Harris Teeter on Central Avenue for 20 minutes after that appointment before I could make myself drive. The radio came on automatically once I started the car, and I turned it off and sat in the gray concrete quiet and tried to organize what I felt into something manageable. I couldn't. I called my mother first. She was 61 years old and a registered nurse, and she did not cry on the phone, which is the thing I needed most from her in that moment. She held steady for me so I could fall apart, and I did, quietly, with her voice on the other end of the line telling me that we would figure out every single piece of this together. Then I called Joelle. Then I drove home and told Derek. He was good in the beginning. I want to be accurate about this because accuracy matters to me, and because he was not a cartoon. He was a person who had real responses to real crisis. And in the immediate weeks after my diagnosis, those responses were present and appropriate. He came to the first 3 appointments. He sat with Dr. Ames and asked the right questions, the kind that showed he had read things. He bought a whiteboard for the kitchen and color-coded my medication schedule in blue and green marker. He held my hand in the car on the way home from the pre-surgery consultation and told me he wasn't going anywhere. The lumpectomy was February 28th. I was home by late afternoon. The first chemotherapy infusion was March 19th, 2020, which was also, as we would shortly learn, the week Charlotte began its COVID shutdown. The world was collapsing in a blue general sense, and my world was collapsing in a precise specific one, and somehow the overlap made both feel more surreal and more isolating. By the second chemotherapy cycle, April, Derek was working from home like the rest of the country, but being in the same physical space as me had not translated to being present. He would set up his laptop at the kitchen table and put his AirPods in and go hours without looking up. I would be 6 feet away, on the couch in the living room, with a plastic bin at my feet for the bad stretches, wrapped in a blanket my mother had mailed from Greensboro, and the distance between us might as well have been a wall. I told myself he was scared. I told myself he was processing in his own way, that men sometimes withdrew when they were overwhelmed, that fear of loss expressed itself in avoidance. I was too tired to push for a different explanation. I had a finite amount of energy, and I needed every bit of it for something else. The third week of my second cycle was late April 2020. I had gotten up at around 5 in the morning to be sick, and couldn't make it back to the bedroom. I lay down on the bathroom floor. The tile was cold, and that was actually good, a relief against my skin, and I waited for the nausea to pass. I heard Derek get up. I heard his footsteps in the hallway. I heard him open the medicine cabinet and fill a glass of water, and I thought, he's coming. I thought, here he comes. I heard his footsteps move past the bathroom door and continue down the hall to the kitchen. He did not check on me. I lay there for a long time. The light under the bathroom door was that specific gray of pre-dawn, that color between night and morning that has no warmth in it at all. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. I thought about nothing in particular. I was too exhausted to form a complete emotion about what had just happened. I filed it somewhere, and I stayed on the floor until I could stand up. There was another moment, maybe a week later, when I had been sick as the hallway and couldn't move from where I'd ended up, sitting with my back against the wall. Derek came through on his way to get dressed for a video call. He stopped. He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as someone calculating something. He said, "Can you make it back to bed okay?" And when I didn't answer, he stepped carefully around me and went to get his shirt from the closet. I am not telling you this for sympathy. I am telling you because it matters to understand what a person's true self looks like when the conditions that allowed them to perform something better have been removed. Derek stepped around me. That is who he was. Everything before that, the napkin notes, the proposal, the whiteboard medication schedule, was the performance. The hallway was the truth. Have you ever had someone show you exactly who they were during your worst moment? Not who they pretended to be in the good times, but the real person underneath all of it. Drop one word in the comments, just one word for what they revealed. I'll read every single one. It was the evening of May 7th, 2020, a Thursday. I know the date because I had had an infusion that morning and I was writing things down by then. Not a journal exactly, more a record, like I needed evidence that the days were real. Joelle had driven me to Levine Cancer Institute and back, which she had been doing since mid-April, and she had made me eat half a piece of toast with peanut butter before she left. I was at the kitchen table in the pale yellow kitchen, wearing a headscarf my mom had sent, and Derek's old UNC sweatshirt because I was always cold, and I was trying to read an article on my phone, without my eyes sliding off the words. Derek came in through the garage door at 7:15. He was wearing his work clothes, even though he'd been working from home all day, which meant he had been outside somewhere, which meant he had not been at his laptop at the kitchen table, the way he told me he was. He sat down across from me, he kept his jacket on. That is the detail I still remember most clearly. The jacket staying on, like a man who wasn't planning to stay long enough to take it off. He said, "Marlena, I need to be honest with you." I put down my phone. He told me he wasn't built for this. He said he had tried. He used that word several times, tried, as if the attempt itself was the thing that deserved credit rather than the outcome. He said he had been feeling suffocated for over a year, and that the illness— he did not say cancer. He did not say my cancer, he said the illness, as if naming it was a step too intimate to take— had forced him to think about his own future. He said staying would be doing both of us a disservice, because he couldn't be the partner I deserved right now. I asked him one question. I said, "Is there someone else?" He said, "That's not what this is about," which is not a no. I have thought about that non-answer many times since. It is a very specific kind of cowardice, not lying, not telling the truth, just stepping around it the way he stepped around me in the hallway. He was out by that weekend. He took the television, his clothes, his golf clubs, and the KitchenAid stand mixer that I had bought for myself as a birthday present 2 years earlier with my own money. I was too tired and too sick to fight about the mixer. I let it go. I had to decide every single hour what was worth my energy, and a kitchen appliance was not on the list. Joelle came on Monday morning with 2 suitcases. She had her own apartment in Plaza Midwood. She sublet it to a friend and moved into my guest room with no discussion of the arrangement and no expiration date. She drove me to every remaining chemotherapy infusion for the rest of my treatment. 9 more sessions over 2 cycles. She sat with me in the waiting room at Levine Cancer Institute while other patients came and went, some with their husbands, some with their mothers, some alone. She made me eat when I couldn't taste anything. She ran Target for me when I couldn't stand up for more than 15 minutes. She talked to me about her design projects and reality television, and the weird neighbor 2 doors down with the wind chimes, because she understood, without my having to explain it, that sometimes the most merciful thing is to let someone forget, just for an hour, that their body is trying to kill them. In August 2020, a mutual friend named Priya Anand texted me a photo. Priya worked in pharmaceutical marketing and had been at a restaurant in Dallantine, the one on Johnston Road with the patio strung with lights, and she had seen Derek there with a woman. The woman was Tiffany Rourke, 29 years old, also in pharma sales, pretty in a calculated way that required a specific kind of audience. Priya had included a caption that said just, "I'm so sorry, you deserve to know, I had suspected." The suspicion had lived in me since the night he sat across that kitchen table with his jacket on. But suspicion and confirmation are not the same thing, and the photograph landed in my chest like a physical weight, something dense and sudden and airless. I found out later, through Priya, who knew someone who knew Tiffany, that they had been involved since November 2019, 4 months before my diagnosis. 6 months before he sat in front of me and said, "That's not what this is about." The divorce was finalized on August 24th, 2020. I signed the papers at the kitchen table in my Noda house, the pale yellow kitchen, wearing a navy headscarf my mother had brought from a shop in Greensboro, and a cardigan borrowed from Joelle, because I was always cold that year. My hands shook slightly from the fatigue. My lawyer had sent the notarized copy to the county clerk twice because of a processing error on their end, and I remember thinking, even the bureaucracy of ending my marriage is refusing to cooperate. I got $194,000 from the sale of the Noda house. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Plaza Midwood. Wood-look vinyl floors, galley kitchen, white tile, lots of light. It was not the pale yellow kitchen. It was fine. Fine was enough. My medical bills came to $2,400 out of pocket, after insurance. I paid them over 14 months, the lastest payment going through on March 15th, 2022. I kept the payment confirmation in a folder on my desktop. I still have it. I think it functions for me the way certain kinds of evidence function. Not to revisit, but to know that the record exists. That the hardest period of my life has a paper trail that proves I made it through. My treatment ended in November 2020. I rang the bell at Levine Cancer Institute on a Wednesday morning, with Joelle on my left and my mother on my right. We were all in masks. It was still deep COVID season, but I could see my mother's eyes above her mask, and that was enough. Doctor Ames, who had not struck me in our entire first year of working together as a hugger, hugged me. It made me cry in a way I hadn't let myself cry in months. The full body kind, the kind that happens when you have been holding something together with both hands for so long that the moment you're finally allowed to put it down, your whole body goes to pieces. I was declared cancer-free on March 4th, 2021. I sat in the parking lot of Atrium Health for 45 minutes after that appointment. I called my mother from the parking lot. I called Joelle. Then I sat quietly for a while with the windows cracked and the early spring Charlotte air coming in, and I held the information carefully, turning it over. I am going to live. I am going to have more years. I am 33 years old, and I am starting over from something I did not choose, and I am going to live. I was not okay yet, but I was here. And I had learned, in the previous 12 months, that here is where everything else starts. Rebuilding does not look like what it looks like in the stories people tell about it. It does not look like a single pivotal morning when you wake up and feel changed. It looks like the 5th bad day in a row and choosing without drama to try again. It looks like 41 job applications sent over 2 months. It looks like printing your resume and proofing it for the 7th time because you need to believe in your own professional worth before you can convince anyone else of it. I went back to Meridian Logistics in January 2021. They were legally obligated to return me to my role under FMLA, and they did, in the technical sense. What they gave me was my title and my desk, and a quiet institutional sidelining that I recognized within 3 weeks. My director, a man named Greg Tatum, who had always been pleasant in the way that covers a multitude of limitations, began looping other team members into decisions that had previously been mine. I was seed on email threads I used to originate. Assignments that fell within my scope were quietly reallocated without explanation. The message was clear without ever being spoken. She was sick. She was complicated. She is now a liability to manage rather than an asset to deploy. I spent 3 months doing excellent work inside a structure that had already decided I was too much trouble. Then I updated my resume and started looking. I sent 41 applications between March and May 2021. I received 7 interviews. I received 1 offer. Praxis Health Solutions, a specialty biotech company focused on oncology pipeline development, which I did not register as ironic until my first week when I saw their logo, a stylized cell division. Graphic on the lobby wall, offered me a people operations manager role at $89,000 a year. I accepted within 24 hours of receiving the offer letter. I started on June 14th, 2021, and I have not had a single day since where I questioned that it was the right decision. My direct sponsor at Praxis, the CHRO role had been vacant for 6 months when I joined, so the org chart was temporarily fluid, was a woman named Sandra Whitfield. She was 52 at the time, head of legal, sharp in the particular way of someone who had spent 25 years being the smartest person in the room, while making sure no one felt threatened by. She gave me real assignments immediately, the kind that required judgment rather than just execution. She asked for my opinion in leadership meetings and then paused and actually listened, which is rarer than it should be. On my third week, I stayed late to finish a restructuring proposal that I had been struggling to get right, and the next morning, I was coffee on my desk with a post-it from Sandra in her small, precise handwriting. Good thinking, keep going. I kept it, the post-it. It is on my desk right now. I was promoted to Senior People Operations Manager in January 2022, salary $108,000. Then to Senior Director of People Operations in April 2023, salary $134,000. I had a team of 4 direct reports. I had a seat at the leadership table, the kind where your voice actually shapes decisions rather than just decorating them. I had an office on the 14th floor with a window that looked out over the Charlotte skyline, the Bank of America Tower, the Duke Energy Center, the uptown grid laid out below in the late afternoon light. I had also slowly and carefully built a life outside of work, which felt in some ways like the harder achievement. Joelle and I had instituted Friendsgiving in November 2020. The first one, just the two of us and my mother, in Joelle's apartment with a bottle of good wine and takeout from an Ethiopian place on Central Avenue, because neither of us had the bandwidth for a real meal. By November 2022, it had grown to 12 people, all of us crowded around Joelle's dining table and the folding card table she borrowed from her neighbor every year, and the tradition was that everyone had to say one thing that had genuinely surprised them in the past year. The year I said I got promoted and I went on my first date since my divorce, and I'm starting to feel like myself again, was the year 3 people cried and Joelle's smoke detector went off because she had, in her 3rd consecutive year of hosting, once again forgotten to set a timer for the turkey. The date I mentioned was Marcus Webb. I met him in September 2022 at a workforce development conference in Raleigh. The same conference circuit, the same city where I had first met Derek, which was an irony I noted privately and then set aside. Marcus was there representing a landscape architecture firm, presenting on sustainable workspace design, and I encountered him at the coffee station before the morning sessions. He was reading a printed-out conference agenda with a pen in his hand, making handwritten notes in the margins, and something about that specific detail, the deliberateness of it, the preference for tangible interaction with information in an era when everyone else was on their phones, made me think he was someone worth knowing. He was 37, tall, soft-spoken in a way that felt like a deliberate choice rather than a personality deficit. When I asked about his work, he talked about it with real engagement, and then asked about mine with the same energy, and we talked through the entire coffee break, and had to walk quickly to make the first session. He texted me that evening, "Good conference, good conversation. If you're ever back in Raleigh or I'm in Charlotte, I'd like to do more of both." I am a professional communicator, and I thought that was the most elegant text I had ever received from a man. We were careful with each other. His patience and mine moved at the same speed, which I think was the thing that made it work. Neither of us was in a hurry to get somewhere, which meant we were both actually present for where we were. By spring 2023, he was staying at my apartment on most weekends and had a drawer and a key and a habit of leaving small notes in my kitchen on the mornings when he left early for a job site. Not grand gestures, steady ones. I had learned by that point to understand the difference between a man who performs love and a man who practices it. And Marcus Webb practiced it in the small and unhurried ways that mean the most. I want to ask you something before I get to October 14th. Because Joelle Tran slept in my guest room for 4 months and drove me to 9 chemotherapy sessions and talked to me about design clients and terrible TV so that I would not have to be alone with the worst of what I was going through. And I want to know, who is your Joelle? The person who showed up without being asked, who rearranged their life to stand next to yours when yours was falling apart. Drop their name in the comments or just a heart if you want to keep it private. I want to know that person exists in your life. It matters more than I can explain. In October 2023, I was leading the search for a senior regional sales director for Praxis's expanded commercial oncology division. It was a significant hire. The role would oversee the Southeast Territory for a product line that had moved into Phase 3 trials and was on track for FDA review, which meant the person in that seat needed to be both technically knowledgeable and relationship intensive. I was partnered on the search with Thomas Everett, our VP of Sales. Thomas was 44, a former research scientist turned commercial leader, the kind of person who asked good questions and trusted other people's expertise. We had engaged Meridian Talent Partners, an executive search firm out of Atlanta, to supplement in our internal pipeline. They had submitted 4 candidates. I had reviewed 3 of the files in detail the Sunday evening before the interview day. Sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of Montepulciano and a printed-out competency rubric. The 4th file I had set aside to review more thoroughly the following morning. I had skimmed the name, noted the pharma background, and made a note to look more carefully. I read the 4th file at 8:47 in the morning on October 14th, sitting at my desk with my office door open and Charlotte spread out in the window behind me. Derek Allen Callahan, 39. Former Senior Sales Director, Novabridge Medical, 2015-2021. Current roles, Regional Sales Director, Ver Therapeutics, 2021-present. Southeast Focus, Oncology and Specialty Therapeutics. I sat with that file for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. He had applied through Meridian Talent Partners without knowing I worked at Praxis. My name had not appeared in the job listing. My title had, but not my name. And the recruiter's submission packet would not have flagged it. Derek had no way of knowing. He had no reason to expect anything other than a standard first-round interview at a company he had identified as a strong next step for his career. He had put on a good suit that morning and driven to uptown Charlotte and taken the elevator to the 14th floor of a building with a view of the skyline. And I sat on the other side of a folder with his name on it. I need you to stop me right here before I tell you what happened when that conference room door opened. Because I have told this story to maybe 6 people total, and every single one of them has had a different answer to this question, and I want yours. If you were sitting where I was sitting, if you opened that file on a Tuesday morning and saw that name, what would you have done? Would you have called the recruiter and pulled the file before he arrived? Would you have walked out, handed the interview to someone else, called in sick, or would you have stayed in that chair? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you would have done. I stayed in that chair. I want to be precise about why, because it was not about him. It was not about wanting to watch him squirm or savor some private moment of theatrical irony. What I felt, sitting at that desk with his file in front of me, was something I can only describe as stillness. I had spent 3 years building a life, and I wanted to know if what I had built could hold this moment without flinching. I straightened my folders. I put my water glass to the right of the laptop. I reviewed the competency criteria I had developed for the role: territory management track record, key account acquisition history, stakeholder relationship depth within hospital systems, retention, and tenure. I would evaluate Derek Callahan on the same rubric I would apply to every other candidate. That was not mercy, and it was not performance. It was just the kind of professional I had chosen to be. His interview was scheduled for 10:15 a.m. At 10:12, I heard voices in the hallway, the receptionist, Kayla, walking someone down from the lobby. At 10:14, I heard the knock on the conference room door. He walked in at 10:15. He was wearing a charcoal suit, a good one, the slightly expensive cut that pharmaceutical salespeople favor for strategic accounts. His hair was shorter than I remembered, a little more silver at the temples, and he looked healthy in the way that someone looks when they have been living their life without interruption. I noticed all of this the way you notice weather. It registered and then it stopped mattering. He saw me the moment he came through the door. I watched it land. His stride broke. Just barely, just a half step, a micro adjustment that someone who had not been watching for it might have missed entirely. He recovered. His shoulders came back. He smiled. He kept walking. He sat down across from me and said, "Marlena, not Miss Voss, not my title. Marlena," as if we were at a dinner party, as if 12 minutes had passed since we'd last seen each other rather than 3 years and 2 months and 11 days, I said, "Mr. Callahan, thank you for coming in." I opened his folder. "I'm Marlena Voss, Senior Director of People Operations. I'll be conducting the first portion of your interview today, and our VP of Sales, Thomas Everett, will be joining us in approximately 20 minutes. Shall we begin?" The silence between us lasted 2 seconds. It felt longer, he said. "Of course. Here is what I want to be clear about. I did not sabotage that interview. I asked him the same questions I had prepared for every candidate in this search. Tell me about a time you managed a significant territory restructuring. Walk me through your largest account acquisition, the timeline, the obstacles, how you closed it. Describe your approach to building and maintaining relationships with hospitals' system administrators and oncology department heads. How do you handle underperformance on an inherited team?" He answered everything. He was polished and prepared, and technically fluent in the language of the role. He was good at his job. That had always been true about him, and I was not going to pretend otherwise, to myself, or to Thomas, or to the professional record of this search. 40 minutes in, Thomas Everett knocked and came through the door. I stood and made the introduction with the same tone I would have used for any colleague joining any interview. Thomas shook Derek's hand and took the seat beside me, and I watched Derek recalibrate, watched the almost imperceptible shift as he processed that there was no private audience to appeal to, no personal history to leverage, no version of this room where what had happened between us 3 years ago had any oxygen to operate in. I had made the room completely level. That was the only thing I wanted to do. The interview wrapped at 11:10. Derek stood and gathered his materials. He shook Thomas's hand and thanked him. Then he looked at me, and in the moment while Thomas was tucking his notepad under his arm, Derek said quietly, just to me, "You look well, Marlena." I said, "The role requirements are outlined in the packet we'll email you. HR will be in touch within 5 business days." I shook his hand. 1 second, firm, professional. I opened the conference room door. Thomas and I spent the next 20 minutes debriefing. He liked Derek's numbers and his manner and the depth of his oncology network. He asked for my assessment. I said he's technically strong. His Nova Bridge tenure shows solid territory management and a competitive account conversion rate. My concern is a retention pattern. His last 2 positions each lasted under 30 months. And for a senior role where relationship continuity with hospital accounts is central to revenue, that pattern creates risk. I'd like to think it through carefully and compare against our other finalists before making a recommendation. Thomas said, "That's fair. Let's regroup Thursday." I walked back to my office and closed the door. I stood at the window for a minute. I looked at the skyline, the towers, the grid, the city laid out below in the flat October light. I waited for something large to come through me. Some wave of release, some cathartic rush of emotion that would match the magnitude of what had just happened. What I felt was something much quieter and more complete than I had expected. I thought about a parking garage in Charlotte in February 2020 when I sat in my car and couldn't make myself move. I thought about the bathroom tile at 5 in the morning, cold against my cheek. I thought about footsteps passing a door. I thought about the headscarf in August and the boxes in the driveway, and $2,400 in medical bills, and Joelle sleeping with her door open so she could hear me if I needed her in the night. And I thought, he had to walk through your door to finish his interview, and you were the one who decided when it was over. I told Marcus that evening. He had driven from Raleigh after his last site visit and brought takeout from Moo and Brew, the burger place on 4th Tryon, which had become a Tuesday default for us, and he sat across from me at my kitchen table while I told him the entire story from the moment I opened the file to the moment I walked Derek out of the conference room. He listened without interrupting. He has a quality of attention that I have come to understand as one of the most valuable things a person can offer. The willingness to actually be in the room while someone else is speaking, to not be somewhere else in your own head. When I finished, he said, "How are you?" Not, "What are you going to do?" Not, "Are you going to hire him?" Just, "How are you?" I said I was okay. And it was the truest thing I'd said in a long time. I told Joelle the following morning over the phone, and she had a different reaction. Joelle is the person who drove me to 9 chemotherapy infusions, who sublet her own apartment to sleep on my couch, who held my hand in the waiting room at Levine Cancer Institutes while Derek was in a restaurant in Ballantyne with another woman. Her reaction was not quiet. It was specific and colorful and deeply personal, and I will not repeat most of it here, but I will tell you that she made me laugh so hard I nearly fell off my kitchen chair, which is also one of the things she has always been best at. I submit assessment of Derek's candidacy to Meridian Talent Partners the following week. My recommendation was that he did not meet the retention profile requirements for the role. It was the recommendation I would have made for any candidate with the same pattern. I had looked at his professional history without the lens of our personal history, or rather, I had looked at both, carefully, and arrived at the same conclusion from both directions. 2 senior-level departures in under 3 years, both under circumstances suggesting either performance pressure or voluntary exit under duress, was not the stability profile that Praxis needed in a relationship-intensive Southeast territory. Thomas thanked me for the thorough analysis, and we moved forward with the other finalists. The role was filled in November. Someone who had been in his previous position for 6 years and had 3 industry letters of reference from hospital system CMOs. The right hire. I don't know if Derek was told specifically why he didn't advance. I don't know if he ever put together that my recommendation had been legitimate rather than retaliatory. That the professional person who showed him out of that conference room was genuinely evaluating his record on its own terms, not punishing him for what he'd done in a pale yellow kitchen in May 2020. I don't know if it occurred to him that those two things, fairness and strength, could exist in the same woman. I hope it did. I also don't need it to. 3 weeks after the interview, Sandra Whitfield and I had coffee at the Daily Press on West Trade Street on a Friday morning. She was retiring in January, and we were making our remaining overlap intentional, turning it into something we were choosing, rather than something that was simply running out. We sat at a window table with our drinks, and the light came in at an angle through the glass, and she asked me how I was feeling about her leaving. I told her honestly, terrified, grateful, and ready. She laughed and said that was exactly the right answer. Then she held her coffee cup with both hands and looked at me with the particular expression of someone who is about to say something real. She said, "You know what I've watched you do in the 3 years you've been here." I said, "What?" She said, "I've watched you walk through something that would have stopped most people and come out. The other side with your integrity completely intact. That's rarer than you know, Marlena. Hold on to it." I did not cry in front of Sandra, who would have found it mildly embarrassing on my behalf. I waited until I got to the parking lot, and then I cried a little, which has become something of a tradition for me. Parking lots, apparently, are where I do my important emotional processing. I called my mother from the car. She asked how Sandra was doing. I told her Sandra had said something kind. My mother said, in the same even voice she used when I called her from the parking lot of Atrium Health on February 6th, 2020. Well, she's right. Ellen Voss, 64 years old, 27 years at Cone Health, my mother. She drove to Charlotte every other weekend during the worst of my treatment and slept on my couch without ever once making me feel guilty for needing her. She is still the first call I make. I think that will be true for the rest of my life. I am 36 years old. I live in Charlotte. In February of this year, Marcus and I moved into a house together, a 3-bedroom in the Cotswold neighborhood, with a yard and a gas stove and white oak cabinets, and so much natural light that the first morning we woke up there, I stood in the kitchen for a full minute just letting it fall on my face. His landscape architect brain, and my need for a functional floor plan made for an unusually thorough house hunt. We looked at 22 properties over 4 months. I knew this one the moment I walked in. I had my 5-year cancer-free milestone appointment with Dr. Patricia Ames in March. She is the same as she has always been. Direct, efficient, unsentimental in exactly the right way. She shook my hand at the end of the appointment and said, "See you at year 10. I am holding her to that. My medical bills are long paid. The Noda house is sold and gone, and I do not miss the pale yellow kitchen, which surprised me when I finally noticed it. I still have the post-it from Sandra on my desk. I still have a photograph of my hair, taken before I started chemotherapy, that I once kept taped to my bathroom mirror to remind me what I was fighting toward. I keep it now in a small frame on my dresser, not as a reminder of what I lost, but as evidence of what I came back from. I think about Derek occasionally, not often. Not with longing and not with anger. Both of those burned out a long time ago, at different rates and in different ways, and what remains is something closer to understanding. Not forgiveness in the soft sense, I don't owe him softness. More like, I understand now that he was never going to be the person that hallway required. And I understand that I spent years trying to need less so that the gap between who he was and who I needed wouldn't have to be acknowledged. That was something I did to myself, and I own it, and I have worked through it, in Dr. Cho's office and on Joelle's couch and in Marcus's patient and unhurried presence, and it does not define me anymore. What defines me is what I chose to do after. There are mornings when I'm getting ready for work, and I catch my reflection in the bathroom mirror, full hair now, which still occasionally catches me off guard, and I think about the woman who lay on a hallway floor at 5 in the morning and heard footsteps pass her door. I want to tell her something. I want to tell her that the people who step over you are giving you the most important information of their lives, and it would be a waste of yours to go on caring what they think. That the $2,400 will get paid. That the parking lots will stop feeling like the worst places in the world and start feeling like where the real conversations happen. That there is a conference room in uptown Charlotte with a view of the skyline. And one day you will sit in it, and a man who stepped around you will walk through the door, and you will not need a single thing from him. Not an apology, not an explanation, not even the satisfaction of watching him realize who you became. You will just need to do your job, and you will be so good at it. That quiet office on an October morning, the skyline silver in the window behind the candidate's chair, the handshake that lasted 1 second. That was the last conversation Derek and will ever have. And I was the one who decided when it was over, not because I needed revenge, because I had become someone who didn't need it. If you see yourself in any part of this story, in the diagnosis, in the abandonment, in the rebuilding, in the moment you finally understood what you were capable of, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in that interview room? Would you have let him walk through the door? Leave a comment. Your story matters. And if you want more stories like this one, everything you need is in the description.